let me start there. How surprised are you that with the release of as much oil from the U.S. and these other nations around the world, there hasn't been a diminishment in the price of oil as a result?
Well, it's certainly true that previous releases from the SPRO have had a larger impact, even when the releases were smaller. For example, I remember back in 2000, we had a so-called swap using the petroleum reserve. It was only 30 million barrels, and the price of oil dropped about 15% quite quickly. So it's a little bit surprising, to be honest, that there hasn't been more movement. On the other hand, I have to say that the run up in prices, while it is quite considerable, is a bit lower than I might have expected as well. So getting into triple digits is something that doesn't surprise us. And I remind you that the Brent benchmark, for example, which is now about $103, $104, was up to about 120. And many traders are not ruling out even a 150 benchmark if the war and the Strait remains blocked for some time.
Mr. Secretary, in a similar vein, I want to ask you about this Defense Production Act move by the Trump administration. They've restarted this Sable. The pipelines are now owned by Sable Offshore in California. But this is a controversial project because it had been shuttered for environmental reasons. This is not something that happened just this week. This has been a long-standing debate between members of the Trump administration and the government of California that wants to keep it closed. The administration wanted to restart production in California, and now they're using the Defense Production Act to get these pipelines going. It could pump about 45,000 to 55,000 barrels a day. Is that going to make any kind of a difference if we're saying that this large glut of oil from the strategic reserve may not make a difference? Why do this?
Well, I would say as a one-off, I don't think it will have a major impact. There are other ways of getting that amount of oil, including, of course, the petroleum reserve release, which will put about 1.4 million barrels a day onto the market once it gets going. But the question is, would the California move, the Defense Production Act move, be part of a broader effort that could put, let's say, the order of 1 million barrels a day? I don't see that at the moment, but I don't know what the planning is. But certainly, as an isolated event, it would appear to be more an exacerbation of the tensions between the federal government and California than a material impact on the current situation. Also, may I just interject that we quite understandably focus on oil, but we also shouldn't forget that the closure of the Strait of Hormuz has a major impact on the liquefied natural gas market, the LNG market. It's also about 20% of the global LNG trade has been taken out of commission, and we are seeing very volatile LNG prices as well in Asia and in Europe. Not in the United States. I mean, natural gas in the United States has stayed fairly stable in price because the international natural gas market is not equilibrated in the same way as oil. But this is a big impact. And natural gas, as a reminder, there may be some options for minimizing the impact on power production, for example. But it's also very important for heating homes, for serving industrial processes. So I wouldn't take my eye off the natural gas markets as well.
Underscoring the importance of that, Bloomberg reporting that India brokered a deal with Iran to get 2 ships of liquefied natural gas out of the Strait to India. So we're seeing the importance they're placing on the emphasis they're placing on the importance of that. Mr. Secretary, I want to get your reaction to what we've seen in the last few weeks. The Treasury Secretary working to relax sanctions on Russian oil sanctions to get Russia some of this oil that is in tankers. And I'm curious what you make of that. He's acknowledged the fact that this kind of diminishes the argument that the Trump administration and the Biden administration before that made about kind of keeping oil away from Russia during its incursion in Ukraine. Your reaction to that, the seeming ease with which they've done that in recent weeks?
Well, obviously this is one mechanism for putting, million or more barrels of oil onto the market. But in the bigger geopolitical context, it's not surprising that Europe, for example, has pushed back very hard because this is putting more funding into the Russian coffers, which presumably will be used against Ukraine. In fact, one of the ironies is the estimates have been that Russia may be gaining $150 million a day extra revenue from the relaxing of sanctions and the increase in the oil price, which they are presumably selling at to mainly China and now India. But the Russians could also be using some of that money to buy more Iranian drones, with a certain irony there, which of course are being used with great impact against the Ukrainians after the Russian invasion.
Yeah.
So personally, I'm not favorable. I think we do need to maintain a broader geopolitical view, and while the administration in the United States is obviously prioritizing the Gulf situation and the domestic gasoline price situation over the Ukrainian situation, for the Europeans, if anything, it's probably in the opposite order. And I do think that we need to maintain our alliances, our strong role in NATO. So basically, I certainly don't like the idea that Russia is getting more revenue right now in the middle of its war against Ukraine.
Mr. Secretary, I'd like to pivot a bit and use the other side of your knowledge, which is on nuclear threats. The president has made the argument that there was an imminent threat in Iran, and that's why he needed to act. It is a point of contention, the breakout time and whether the amount of time it would take of Iran to go from the level of enriched uranium it had to a functional nuclear weapon had increased at all in recent weeks or months. First of all, what is your take on how imminent that nuclear threat is? Is it any more than it was last summer when the U.S. attacked and said then it had obliterated most of the nuclear facilities? And if the regime were to fall, are you concerned about securing that enriched uranium, that nuclear material, should there be a non-functional government in Tehran?
Well, yes, I am quite concerned, but I think it's very important to put this in a certain context. And frankly, I don't believe this is being emphasized enough. Namely, that starting in 2021, Iran began enriching to 60% purity, if you like. And in the media, with all due respect, I think the message is consistently that it's not quite weapons grade.
Right.
But what is not stated is that you do not need weapons grade to make a nuclear explosive. And 60% enriched uranium was quite adequate for being used directly in a nuclear explosive. So in my view, Iran had crossed a red line in the sense of accumulating enough weapons usable material for, approaching, let's say, 10 explosives. So was there a particular event that made the weapon threat more imminent? I didn't see any, but I do want to emphasize that since 2021, they have been accumulating a lot of directly weapons usable material. And that, to me, is my highest priority on the nuclear side, would be resolving the issue of where that material is. The Iranians have stated that it's pretty much buried under rubble in Isfahan.
Right.
I'm not taking anything at face value. Certainly, the IAEA has stated, the International Atomic Energy Agency has stated that the material was spread out over 3 locations. But I don't even take that at face value, in the sense that as the military actions last June neared, I would not exclude that Iran moved some fraction of that material to yet another hidden location. So I think resolving that issue of the 60% uranium is the #1 priority on the nuclear side. And I don't see any realistic way of doing that other than after the fighting stops, one way or another, and I don't have the answer, getting the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors back into Iran with cooperation from whatever is the Iranian government at that time to resolve the question of where is the 60% uranium and how do we get rid of it. I think there has been no credible explanation from the Iranians as to why one would have 60% enriched uranium
Yeah.
for any civilian purpose. And I think the number one priority is to find the stuff and get rid of it.
We woke up this morning to news that North Korea had tested some ballistic missiles in the overnight hours.
There wasn't enough going on.
Yeah. President Trump readying to make this trip to China to meet with President Xi, and he's, I think, admitted that he'd like to meet with the North Korean leader as part of that trip. As we focus so much on the Middle East, what is your counsel about how much we should be concerned about what's happening in North Korea and the prospect of them developing or using weapons, nuclear weapons going forward?
Well, obviously, in a time like this in the Middle East and with so many military assets committed there, other players like the North Koreans certainly can be up to mischief. And I would say that in terms of long-range missiles, the North Koreans were certainly well ahead of the Iranians. We have been concerned that Iran was on a trajectory to have intercontinental range ballistic missiles, let's say within a decade. But of course, North Korea has already demonstrated such missile capability. I do want to I don't want to hyperventilate in the sense that the North Koreans as well have not, to my knowledge, demonstrated that they could mate a nuclear weapon to a long-range missile and have it survive in the difficult conditions of reentry of such a missile. But they clearly are well ahead, and they are putting down a marker, I think, prior to the summit in China, that they should not be relegated to the back burner.